One of the best things that happens is Athlon Sports doing its anonymous coach quotes. Okay. The anonymous coach quotes from each conference. We have the anonymous coach quotes about the Big 12. I have pulled what I thought were some of the most interesting. And in particular, there are a couple of quotes here about teams that these coaches basically think could be running the league moving forward. That I thought was the most compelling part about all this, but there are some good, keen insights on a lot of schools here. Okay, so I think people would be very interested in what it is that other coaches are saying about schools across the league when they're granted anonymity. All right, so Utah. All right, this is a pretty long quote about Utah. And I will admit, I read the Utah quotes. There were 4 or 5 of them. And I was like, well, it doesn't seem like the coaches are maybe quite as high on Utah as I am coming into this year. But here's one of the quotes on Utah. Quote, there's a lot of questions here, mainly on offense. Andy Ludwig and Cam Rising are gone, and they're going with a spread and RPO scheme. It's going to look very different than what we're used to from this program. Kyle Whittingham's teams are defined by their physicality, and this is going to be more of a tempo, bang-bang approach to keep pace in the league. Yeah, I hadn't really considered, okay, it will be just a different team stylistically. How much can that affect, if the offense is going quick 3 and out, if they're struggling to get it going at the beginning of the year, does that put more pressure on your defense? How will things integrate here? I will continue to say that I think bringing Devin Dampier's offensive coordinator with him should help smooth some of that out and mitigate some of the challenge. But it is still very much a challenge. And when you're a coach like Kyle Whittingham this late in your career, you can look at it and say, hey, he should be great at dealing with some kind of new integration into his program. Or you could look at it and say, man, old dog, new tricks. Like, how's that going to go? I think it's perhaps a little bit more risky than I had considered. But quite frankly, if you watch Utah's offense last year, they needed to do something. You needed total overhaul, total changes. If it was going to require some risk, you might as well do it. But that was my takeaway from Utah. It was kind of like, all right, doesn't seem like there's quite as much Utah optimism as I had there. Texas Tech, right? Arguably the most interesting team in the Big 12 this year because of what they did this offseason. Here's a quote from an anonymous coach. They're better pretty much everywhere, obviously, but don't assume you can spend your way to a power conference championship in one cycle. Don't get me wrong. All of us would rather have an NIL collective that's throwing a ton of cash instead of the alternative, but there's a lot of questions here. That's kind of the thing with Texas Tech, right? Like, how much in football can you really fix it this way? Basketball would be one where you would think, hey, less players on the court, easier to fix by just throwing a ton of money at the problem with NIL. And even in basketball, look no further than within the Big 12 in and of itself with K-State last year, or different scale, but Kansas. Kansas threw a bunch of money, got high-profile guys, Rylan Griffin, AJ Storr. Didn't work. Kansas, by their standards, had a horrible season. So it doesn't always work like that. Like throwing the money, even when it's a little less, it seems a little more doable in basketball because you don't need as many players there. Whereas Texas Tech football, they're asking the question, can you do it in one cycle? Which to me means more like, can you get enough players to really affect like quality depth across the board to make that significant of an impact? But even then, it's, can you integrate if you have more stars? How does all that mesh with your culture and all these things? I think all very fair questions. And it was interesting to me to see a coach reiterate that. K-State, I felt like, again, as a K-State guy here, right? I don't hide from that. I was a little surprised. I was like, man, they seem pretty positive on K-State. Particularly, there was a lot of Matt Wells love, who was going to be K-State's offensive coordinator this year. And will obviously work quite a bit with Avery Johnson. And here's a quote on Avery. One of the anonymous coaches in the Big 12 said, quote, Avery could be a superstar, a Heisman-level guy. But they've got to build up the talent around him. This could be one of the best and most creative offenses in the country this season if he continues to improve. I think if you want optimism as a K-State fan, that's where like Matt Wells comes in. Can he be more creative than K-State was last year with Avery? And some of that may well be because he was so young. That is fair. I'm not going to try and pin it all on Connor Riley there. But getting him a year older, working with a more experienced offensive coordinator, if you can get more creative, I do think K-State has some legit weapons on offense. I mean, they brought in a 5-star tight end. They've got Dylan Edwards, who's a year earlier. They brought in a couple of transfer receivers they really like, and they kept Jace Brown. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that he's got the weapons to be really effective. Another team that Big 12 coaches anonymously were very, very high on was Iowa State. A lot of Iowa State love. Here's a couple of quotes. One, just simply, they really could go to the Big 12 title game again. And the reason I'm going to read you this one is because I thought, on this, like, wait, it says Rocco is the real deal. Obviously talking about Rocco Becht. And he'll be better this season if they can install those transfer receivers in. And I thought, man, I was of the mind like, hey, Rocco Becht just lost 2, a second and third round NFL starting wide receiver. Like are we really just going to say they're going to plug the transfer receivers in and he'll be better? I mean, I like the transfer receivers. They go to East Carolina, UCF, grab a couple of transfer receivers. I like what they got. But I don't know that that's replacing Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins, right? Like, man, I don't know. That now, having said that, could Iowa State make the Big 12 championship game? Absolutely, yes, absolutely they could. And Rocco Becht is still a really good quarterback. He could be the best in the Big 12 this year. I just think that's what we'll find out with them is how much of it was having just elite wide receivers last year. Colorado, I bet you were all wondering what Big 12 coaches had to say about Colorado. Well, this was the quote that definitely drew headlines when it first got out there. Quote, "It's still a circus. That's not an insult to Dion, but it is." So we're going to call Colorado still a circus. Circus is probably a little strong. We've got a bigger circus in town in college football now with the Bill Belichick experience at North Carolina, which feels to me like it's taking some of the national circus mentality away from Colorado a little bit. Just my opinion from watching from the outside. In terms of the reality of the team, you had 2 quotes that I thought were like opposite sides of the fence here. So Colorado says they've turned over a ton in the portal and they're trying to make it out like it's a competition-based result, but they're really going to struggle on the offensive line because of transfers again. So there's one half, which is saying like, hey, they're still not going to have an offensive line. That's kind of been the deal for a while. They're still not going to have it. But then somebody else said, hey, Travis Hunter is so good, he overshadowed a really good position group in the secondary. Right now, that's their strength. If they can rework the front, the defense might be better overall. So some reason for optimism and something on the other side there for Colorado. Finally, come down the home stretch here. I told you there were 2 teams here that I thought anonymous coaches really felt like could be the ones that run the league moving forward. Let's start with BYU. BYU. 2 statements here. One that Utah fans will really, really love. Well, both of these Utah fans will really, really love. But the first anonymous coach quote about BYU was, quote, "Picking up all the Utah guys in the portal was a pretty big statement for them." Picking up all the Utah guys in the portal was a pretty big statement for them. Whew. Utah fans, I'll just let that one sink in. BYU fans, how you feeling about that one? And then this to me, the much more interesting one. Quote, "I think they're a legit power in this league." Now, that's a statement. An opposing coach saying, I think BYU is a legit power in this league. There was another one of the quotes that said BYU absolutely could have won the Big 12 championship had they made it to that title game. So there was a lot of BYU love and a lot of Sataki love and a lot of general BYU program love, which I guess the difference between BYU and Utah in the quotes here, to me, I view them as a little more similar going into next year. If you were just reading these quotes and knew nothing else about Utah and BYU, you'd be like, oh, well, BYU is definitely in the better spot here out of the 2. It's not even close. So there's that. I'll just float that one out there from the anonymous coaches. Baylor, one coach did say they could turn the corner and compete for the league title this season. I definitely do feel like that's a possibility. I like Baylor a lot. I'm pretty high on them. I think Robertson and Washington, that backfield is pretty damn dynamic. But I would have also said, hey, Dave Aranda can certainly figure out a defense. It seemed to get better last year. But one of these anonymous coaches rather said defensively they were a mess even with Dave calling it. But they've turned over the personnel and some of the assistants. So still apparently thinking that Baylor's defense was a mess. Maybe the changes there will help. Just maybe a slightly more pessimistic, being like, all right, so there's a lot of change there on that side of the ball, and people thought they were a mess already, even with Aranda taking it back over. We'll see. All right, so who's the other team that coaches think could run the league? Well, who have I not mentioned yet? It's the defending Big 12 champs, Arizona State. Quote, they're going to be at the top of the league for a while. So one of the opposing coaches, is buying in on the young Kenny Dillingham, who is younger than me, just barely, but younger than me, and running a Big 12 championship caliber program. There's another quote here on Arizona State. Our league is very volatile right now, so there's an idea another program might jump out of nowhere like these guys did. But it's hard to pick against them as the best right now. They won the league and return almost everybody. They do return almost everybody, but the one guy that we can talk about them not returning is a pretty big one. And I did just say Kenny Dillingham, pretty young coach, because you know what? Damn it. If you are in your mid-30s, like Kenny Dillingham is, you are young as hell. Totally very young person to be in your mid-30s. Take it from me. Okay? So young coach handling expectations for the first time. How will that go?